talked a bit about the problem with over-recruiting the pelvic floor muscles, but we haven't really specifically gone into the details about what this problem can actually lead to or cause and why we care so much about this topic. And we haven't talked about why there is an over-recruitment problem in the first place. So let's explore those questions. And before we move on, I just want to point out that the term over-recruited pelvic floor muscles can be used interchangeably with other terms that you may have heard, like hypertonic pelvic floor muscles or the hypertonic pelvic floor, tense pelvic floor muscles or pelvic floor muscle tension, and also the term that's being used more and more in the literature is non-relaxing pelvic floor. And if you look at the Fabian et al. 2012 article, they actually use the term non-relaxing pelvic floor dysfunction in there. So over-recruited pelvic floor muscles can lead to and or exacerbate these conditions. And what you see below here, this is what has been supported by the research. So urinary incontinence, urinary frequency and or urgency, overactive bladder, SI joint pain, low back pain, hip, groin pain, constipation, irritable bowel syndrome, sexual dysfunction, and a variety of pelvic pain disorders. So why are pelvic floor muscles even over-recruited in the first place? I have some ideas and I will go through them with you. So the first, I think, is it could be because of our postural habits. Remember the research that showed people that were in the posterior pelvic tilt, so if you're sitting a whole lot throughout the day for many years and that's just one of your habits, the research showed that the posterior pelvic tilt was the posture that correlated most with the high resting tone of the pelvic floor. Another reason may be that emotional link that we know to pelvic floor muscle tension and different emotions, like if we have unmanaged stress or poorly managed stress and it's causing anxiety or worry, fear, that can cause the pelvic floor muscles to be over-recruited or not relaxing. And just remember that scary movies study where the women were watching scary movies and sure enough, their pelvic floor was engaging in all the suspenseful parts. I think it's important here to just point out that this area, the pelvic floor, the pelvis area, can also be seen as an area that's taboo or we feel guilty about or ashamed about. There's a lot of sexual trauma in this area as well. The most recent statistic that I've seen is that 1 in 4 women are sexually abused and 1 in 6 men are sexually abused. And even just the word Pudendal nerve, which is one of the nerves that innervate the pelvic floor muscles, that word pudendal, the Latin root, pudet means shame, or pudenda means to be ashamed of. So I think this area in general just has a lot of shame and guilt and negative feelings that may contribute to some of the holding and guarding and tension in the pelvic floor. And I think too, our cultural habits and the norms that we have may contribute to this problem. So for example, we just look at when we talk about the abdominals and we look at aesthetics, we think it looks healthy and it's a picture of health to have that the flat abdominal stomach and to make it look like the washboard. And that over-recruitment of the abdominals can also be linked to and correlated to an over-recruitment of the pelvic floor muscles. And then even just in our culture, there's this notion for women to have sort of tight, if we use that word actually, tight pelvic floor muscles. And supposedly that's supposed to help with intercourse and sexual pleasure. And I mean, that is just not the case. Yes, we need to engage and be strong and be able to control them, but we have to also be able to release and let go. So I think there's some of that in our culture. And then as well, just think of something like holding our flatulence. So, it's not appropriate to just let them rip in, in public, right? We're supposed to hold in that gas. And I think to a degree, often we're not even thinking about it anymore. It's just a habit to hold and not let go. So I think that might be causing some tension in the area. And then I think too, just the fact that this is what we're told we're supposed to do. We're getting these instructions from people that we respect and that we learn from. And so we listen, and we have this notion, I think, that we are supposed to train the core, do our Kegels, and I think that comes from a very, very well-intended place from healthcare professionals and fitness professionals. It's just now that we're starting to learn that it's a little bit more refined than just the holding. And then I think too, if you suffer from urinary leakage or pelvic organ prolapse, I think there is a tendency to hold and contract and engage. And I think at first it might be more conscious. And then as the days and weeks and years progress, I think it just becomes this sort of automatic subconscious pattern that you're holding because you're afraid that you're going to be leaking or prolapsing. The way we breathe can also influence pelvic floor muscle tension. We talked a little bit about this in the breathing section, but I think I'll just reiterate here that when you are breathing with the accessory muscles of respiration, whether they're the neck muscles, the upper chest muscles, that can lead to a sympathetic nervous system dominant state. So it feeds into even more fear, fright, flight response, which is then an overall body tension. And if you're sort of living like that day in and day out, I think that can definitely contribute to this over-recruitment problem. Another point to make here in the area of breathing is that from a mechanical perspective, sometimes people who believe that when they inhale, the pelvic floor goes up and in. I think some people are practicing that, whether it's volitionally or it just becomes a habit. So, for example, if someone's at a yoga class regularly or a fitness class and they're training, every time they inhale, they're pulling up and in and they're trying to hold it in, I think that definitely would contribute to pelvic floor muscle tension because they're not inhaling and allowing the pelvic floor to descend. Poor bladder habits is another potential cause of pelvic floor muscle tension, or contributing factor. So I would say here two scenarios. One is if we are going to the bathroom, we're trying to empty our bladder just in case, so that we don't have to go later on when we're taking that long trip. Now, that is not a good habit to get into. What happens is we potentially can start to train the bladder to train our system to feel or sense the urge before the bladder is really full. And then that just creates more sensitivity of the system, and the pelvic floor muscles are going to be more tense and held because you don't want to leak, and that's going to be happening more and more frequently throughout the day, more than it should be happening. And then the second point here, another poor bladder habit I think that we have in our culture anyway, is that we don't take the time when we're on the toilet necessarily, and we could be rushing and we don't maybe fully empty the bladder. And I know that happened with me. I have firsthand experience. I used to work in a very, very busy outpatient orthopedic setting for many years, and I just didn't even have time to go to the bathroom. So when I would go, it was just, I was already thinking of finishing even before I started. And so I think that too can cause issues of not fully emptying and just not taking the time, and overall then the pelvic floor may be more recruited or overengaged than we need it to be. And then the last point here I have on the workbook you can see in front of you is pain. So there's a relationship between pain and pelvic floor tension. We know that. And just think of it as a cycle. So you can have pelvic pain, and that's going to contribute and create more pelvic floor tension, but you can also have pelvic floor tension, and that's going to feed more into the pain. So it's sort of this cycle. And two, we talk about persistent pain. The nervous systems can change, and where we have a very sensitized nervous system. So it's called central sensitization. And in this case, the whole system feels like it's on high alert, it's hypervigilant, so the output is going to be to protect and to guard. And so in that case, you can have many muscles, not just the pelvic floor muscles, but many muscles can be tense and holding and guarding. And so I do think that pain in general is another reason why the pelvic floor muscles could be over-recruited. And one more point there on pain. Remember the study that's in press right now with Van Dyken and Dufour about low back pain. Those 100 women with low back pain, 84% did have an over-recruited pelvic floor. So go ahead and think of other factors that you think may be contributing to an over-recruited pelvic floor. And if you think of any, share them with us on the forum.